Welcome back, students of Theory 101. This is Professor Seth Monahan with our third online lesson. This week we move beyond the fundamentals of music to tackle a new topic, harmonic species counterpoint. Here is an overview of our lesson. We're going to begin by answering the broadest question, what is counterpoint? Then we move on to the types of motion you can have between two voices. Then we're going to discuss how you compose a counterpoint in the harmonic species style. And finally, we're going to do a first species workshop where we actually work through one whole example from start to finish. So let's begin with, what is counterpoint? Where do we find it? Counterpoint's a very broad concept, but we can boil it down to this. It involves the combination of musical lines that unfold at the same time in an organized fashion. So there's two key elements here. There's more than one thing going on at once, more than one melody. And then they have to be organized. They have to be coordinated together. It can't just be two things happening together randomly or by happenstance, like when you hear two people in adjacent practice rooms. There has to be some kind of connectedness so that they combine to form a musical whole. Counterpoint is sometimes called polyphony, poly meaning many, phonic meaning voices. Polyphonic music contains many voices simultaneously. The term counterpoint itself, the adjectival form is contrapuntal, as in Bach's music uses a lot of counterpoint. It is highly contrapuntal. It's not counterpointal or contrapuntal or contrapunctal, which are all words I've unfortunately heard in my life. So the question is, where do we find counterpoint? And the truth is we find it in basically every Western style for almost 1,000 years. When we think about counterpoint, we may think first of Baroque music, and especially the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Here is the opening of the first fugue in his collection, the Well-Tempered Clavier, which actually contains 48 fugues. Now, a fugue is simply a polyphonic or contrapuntal composition where a tune enters, and then it begins to enter in other voices, and you have a gradual thickening of the texture so that by the end of the example we'll hear here, there will be 4 voices moving at once, all of them set into motion with an echo of this basic tune. So here's a recording of this, and I'll show you where each new contrapuntal voice enters. Now, of course, counterpoint wasn't invented in the Baroque period. We can actually go back much further to the medieval period. Here's a composition by Guillaume de Machaut, who's a very important composer from the middle of the 1300s or so. And here we have a composition for 3 voices. Now, this is counterpoint as it existed many hundreds of years before Bach, and it has a very different sound. Notice, for instance, that the voices are not as clearly distinguished in register. They're kind of overlapping each other's space a little bit. The actual harmonies that they present are often very bracing and kind of strange to modern ears. But it is counterpoint nonetheless. You can follow 3 distinct lines here. The text that they will sing is, "Beauty which is the equal of all beauties, haughty and distant toward me." And the contrapuntal tradition extends through the Baroque period, through the classical period, into, for instance, Romantic music. Here's the opening of a piece by Gustav Mahler. This is actually from the early 20th century. And Mahler is a very contrapuntal composer, and here you can see that there's a texture that's built of a gradual accumulation of voices. This is a piano reduction of an orchestral score. But notice here now, some of the voices are given a more background role, other ones given a more foreground role. On the whole, it has a more modern sound, but it's still very contrapuntal. We even find counterpoint in atonal music. Let's turn here to the godfather himself of atonal music, Arnold Schoenberg. Here is a piece from only a few years after Mahler's piece that we just heard, but it's a decisive move into the future in terms of the musical style. There are 3 instrumentalists here, each of whom has a contrapuntal line or more than one contrapuntal line in the piano's case, and there's a singer as well who is using what's called the Sprechstimme technique, which is a creepy combination of singing and talking that Schoenberg invented for this piece. It has a very odd effect, I'm sure you'll notice. The text here is also fairly creepy. As a bleached drop of blood stains a sufferer's lips, so lurks within this music the lure of annihilation.
Wie ein blasser Tropfen Bluts färbt die Lippen einer Kranken. Also ruht auf diesen Tönen ein vernichtungssüchtiger Reiz.
Now, it's not limited to classical music by any means. You can turn to popular music and find very complicated counterpoint. I'm going to play a song by the Beatles in a moment, and you'll hear a very sophisticated combination of independent musical parts. There's a bass line, there are several guitar parts, there's a very busy drum part, and also solo vocal line and then backing vocals. And all of them have rhythmic and melodic independence, and they combine to form a very engaging, I think fairly sophisticated musical totality. Since I don't have a score for this, I'm going to let you look at the original music video from the 1960s. When the sun shines, they slip into the shade. The sun shines down my way. The sun shines, sunshine. When the sun shines. So really, we find counterpoint all over Western music since about 900 A.D. And a lot of jazz and a lot of jazz and popular music is contrapuntal. Anytime you really have a melody and an independent bass line, you have counterpoint. Even music that you think of as not being especially contrapuntal, that is to say music that seems like it's more organized around vertical chords, has counterpoint in some sense. Here is a short chorale by Johann Sebastian Bach, and although you could think of this on the one hand as a tune plus harmony underneath it, all of the vocal parts are actually designed to be very melodic, very singable, very lyrical, and that counterpoint does actually occur between all these parts. Here is this being sung. The text is from the St. Matthew Passion. When I must once and for all depart, then do not depart from me. When I must suffer death, then stand by me. And if you have the soprano part there, it's perfectly lovely. But the alto part is no less beautiful. And so on. These are a pleasure to sing, partly because all of the parts are melodically interesting. All of them are part of a very dense contrapuntal structure. So what is species counterpoint? Species counterpoint is a pedagogical method. It's a way that we've taught counterpoint in the West for several hundred years, and it's organized as a series of progressive exercises. Each type of exercise is more complicated than the last one. It builds on what you've learned in the earlier exercise types, but usually adds one or two new elements that the student then must grapple with and master. And there have been lots of species methods throughout history, the most famous by a long shot being that developed by Johann Joseph Fuchs, his Steps to Parnassus, was a very famous book published in the early 1700s, and a number of classical noteworthies studied from this book, including Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn. All three of the giants of that era used Fuchs's counterpoint method. We will not be using that method. We'll be using something called harmonic species counterpoint, which was designed by me in the summer of 2010, specifically for Theory 101. Harmonic species is a merger of traditional species counterpoint with a Roman numeral figured bass structure. Those Roman numerals, if you've done traditional Fuchsian counterpoint, there are no Roman numerals, and you don't really analyze that in terms of chords at all. Here we're going to be thinking in terms of harmony, but also using the contrapuntal principles of species counterpoint. So it works like this. The teacher gives the student a bass line with Roman numerals and figured bass. And then the student responds by writing a melody above that bass line, observing certain kinds of restrictions, which are all consistent with how classical music is written. One thing that's very useful about harmonic species counterpoint is that the rules we learn here are going to carry forward into all our harmonic writing for the semester, even in 4 parts. So in first species, we use all chord tones. In second species, we add passing tones. In third species, we add neighbor tones. And finally, in fourth species, we add accented non-chord tones. And you can look ahead, if you like, and see examples of all these in the online ebook that corresponds to this portion of the course. The reason why we do this particular type of exercise now in Theory 101 is it allows us to focus on writing melody. When we jump right into 4-part harmony, there's so much focus on chords and making sure all 4 voices are doing what they need to be doing that it can detract from the focus we give to melody. So here we're writing melodies, and we have breathing room now to think about their contour, their shape, how the melody and the bass line interact, the kind of intervals that they use, the kind of motions they use against each other, and ultimately how melody relates to harmony, because each exercise is governed by a certain harmonic structure that is given in the Roman numeral and figured bass. So let's move on now to an issue that is at the heart of counterpoint, which is how voices move against each other, motion between voices. You'll know from your reading that there are 4 types of motion. The first is when one voice moves and the other doesn't. And that's called oblique motion. The second type is when you have voices moving in opposite directions. And that's called contrary motion. Here we have voices moving in the same direction but by different distances. And that's called similar motion. Notice that the bottom voice moved by a step and the top voice moved by a fifth. There's also a type of motion when you have voices moving the same direction and the same distance. So here we have what's called parallel motion. Each voice moves in the same direction by the same distance. Now let's make sure we understand the difference between similar and parallel motion, because they both involve voices moving in the same direction. Notice with similar motion, one key element here is that the vertical intervals between the 2 voices change. Here, because one voice moves farther than the other, they start on a third, but they end on a sixth. That doesn't happen in parallel motion. In parallel motion, because the 2 voices move the same distance in the same direction, it preserves the vertical interval between them. So here we start on a third, they both move by step, and what results is another third. So the vertical interval stays the same. Now let's talk about some restrictions with motion. Probably the most famous prohibition in traditional harmony is that you can't have 2 voices moving in parallel perfect fifths or octaves. What does that mean? Here we have 2 voices articulating a perfect fifth. And what you can't do is have them both move in the same direction by the same distance so that they produce another perfect fifth where they arrive. That kind of motion between voices was prohibited for a very long time in classical music. There's nothing inherently bad about it. It's a sound you'll hear in lots of 20th century music. But because we're talking about style-specific composition, what we're doing is recreating the style of the 17 and 1800s. We need to observe the rules that they observed. And the reason that they didn't have parallel fifths is because it cuts down on the independence of each voice. There's a kind of a hollow sound. It almost sounds like a single voice being accompanied by a kind of a ghost voice. A related prohibition is that we want to avoid parallel motion from a diminished fifth into a perfect fifth. So here's the white note diminished fifth, B to F. And we want to avoid parallel motion into a perfect fifth. That diminished fifth wants to do something very different and collapse into a third by moving it to a fifth. There's a hollow sound. We have a very dissonant sonority followed by a very consonant one. It's just a bit jarring. And here's the last of these. You can't have the upper voice leap into a perfect interval when it's moving in similar motion to the bass. So here's a vertical third moving into a perfect fifth. Similar motion between the voices. Top voice leaps. That's to be avoided. That's something that in the classical style you're just not going to hear very often. It draws a lot of attention to that perfect fifth. And again, the difference between the sweet consonant third and that empty fifth is just too strong. So let's move on now to composing a counterpoint. As already mentioned, in first species and all the other species, the teacher gives the student, that's you, a bass line with Roman numerals underneath it. This is the same bass line I use as the main example in your counterpoint text, so this may sound familiar to you. In first species, you're going to write a melody that moves in whole notes, just like the bass. So there's going to be one whole note per bar in the melody, as well as the bass. And the melody consists in first species only of chord tones. You can only use the notes that are in the chords indicated by the figured bass. So it's good, at least at first, to really be thinking about the top staff here as a kind of a lattice of available notes. What are the notes that you can use here? Now we're in C major. The first bass note is a C. It's a tonic chord, 1 in root position. And hopefully you know that that means that the available notes here, the chord tones, are going to be C, E, and G. And I've noticed here I've indicated in gray C, E, and G kind of within the available space for a treble clef melody. We really don't want to get any higher or lower than this generally. And of course, those same notes are going to be the available chord tones over any tonic chord, regardless of whether these are in root position, first inversion, second inversion, and we have all three here. The available notes are going to be C, E, and G. So then we could perform a similar exercise with the other chords in the example. We could say, oh, there's our 4 chord. What are the notes in 4? F, A, and C. Those are the kind of available mid-register F, A's, and C's over our 4 chords. And finally, there's some triads on 5, which make G, B, and D available. So this is a useful visual aid because our melody, our counterpoint that we write against this bass line, is going to navigate through this kind of framework of available chord tones somehow. And there are lots of different melodies we could write above it. I'm going to show an actual melody in red here, beginning on an octave above the bass with a C, moving in contrary motion to a G, which creates a third above the bass. Notice I'm indicating generic interval sizes here between the staves. So when I show a second 3 here, it means we moved in parallel motion up by step, still a third away from the bass. Similar motion, now creating a vertical 6th. Contrary motion creating a vertical 3rd. And by third, I mean that includes tenths as well. I'm compressing all the interval names to within an octave. Contrary motion into a 6th, parallel motion into another 6th, oblique motion into a 5th, and contrary motion into an octave. And that melody sounds like this. But we could write another one. Here we could start, say, on a 3rd above the bass, which puts us in a new register, which is going to present another host of options. Here we can move in parallel thirds, moving by contrary motion into an octave, similar motion into another 3rd, similar motion into a 3rd, parallel motion into a 3rd, 2 parallel thirds in a row, oblique motion into a 4th, oblique motion into a 3rd, and similar motion back into an octave. And this gives us another melody. one that I like as much as the first one, but that's still pretty good. So when writing your melody, in addition to using only chord tones in first species, you need to not forget your motion restrictions. You can't use parallel fifths, you can't lead a diminished fifth into a perfect fifth in similar motion, and then there's that third restriction about having the top voice leap by similar motion into a perfect interval. You can also not cross the voices. That means you can never have the melody go below the bass line. We call the bass line for a reason. Another consideration is that you make it singable. It's possible to do an exercise like the one shown here where no rule has been violated, but the melody here is not designed for human use. I could try to sing it, but that would probably be unfortunate. So I can play this for you. It's also important to avoid the opposite problem, which is writing a melody so narrowly confined that it's not really melodic at all. It's possible to do this often on scale degree 5 of the tonic key, and you end up with a line. You can have a line that really noodles around on 1, 2, 3 notes. And I think you'd agree that that's not especially musical. And finally, this is a preference rule, but it's an important one. You want to prefer imperfect consonances to perfect consonances. That may seem counterintuitive, given that the ones we're avoiding are called perfect, and the ones we're preferring are called imperfect. But you're going to get a more resonant sound if you use more tenths, more thirds, more sixths than, say, fifths and octaves. Most preferable of all, in many cases, are the dissonant intervals, but those only occur within certain chords. So here's an example, same bass line. I've written a melody that uses a frustratingly high number of perfect intervals, and you can hear that it has a kind of a hollow, empty sound. Not great. Now, there are just a few more things to consider. First, you shouldn't leap out of chords marked with asterisks. I'm aware there's an error in this video that shouldn't say voices, it should say chords. I'm doing this to save you the trouble of learning at this stage a bunch of rules regarding dissonance treatment. So if you have a chord marked with an asterisk, simply leave it by step, and you should produce something that's, in most cases, fairly consistent with the style we're aiming to replicate. Don't double the leading tone, that's scale degree 7, in a 5-6 or a 5-6-5 chord. So when the bass is on the leading tone, you should stay off of it. And generally in the melody, when you have the leading tone, it should go up to tonic. The only exception being when the leading tone is in a 3 chord, and in that case it's not really acting like the leading tone. If we're in C, if we've harmonized scale degree 7 with a dominant chord, it wants to go up. If we were to harmonize it in a 3 chord, it might want to go down, but that's going to be much rarer. We're going to see a lot more 5 chords than 3 chords in these exercises. Now finally, we have to touch on the topic of cadences. Cadences are harmonic and melodic formulas that were used in the classical style to end phrases. In harmonic species counterpoint, I give you the harmonies and tell you what type of cadence I'd like. Your job is to supply the correct melodic component. So let's look at these, provide an overview here. The PAC stands for Perfect Authentic Cadence, and that involves a root position 5 or 5-7 chord, not an inversion, a root position 5 or 5-7 chord going to a tonic chord. And this is a cadence that gives very strong closure. This is the strongest possible closure. This is something you often will hear at the end of pieces, for instance. And the melody has to move by step into tonic. So there's our dominant. Melody moves from 2 to 1, or maybe from 7 up to 1. Related to the PAC is the IAC, or imperfect authentic cadence. This involves the same chords, 5 or 5-7, in root position, moving to 1, and it's slightly weaker closure, because rather than having the melody on scale degree 1, the melody ends on scale degree 3, or sometimes scale degree 5. So, keeping with the same key, if we were to have... It's called imperfect because we end on an imperfect interval, a tenth between the outer voices. We could also do this. It's closure, but it's weak closure. And lastly, there's the HC, or half cadence. Now for this, we simply end a phrase on a dominant chord. And what this does is provide no closure. If the authentic cadences are equivalent to periods, half cadences are equivalent to question marks. They generate the expectation that more music is going to follow. And with these, any dominant note is okay in the melody. Now, to get a sense of what a half cadence sounds like, here's the example we've heard several times, but I've changed the ending here so that it ends on a 5 chord. And notice that I've labeled the cadence in brackets an HC. There's our half cadence on 5, and it seems to invite a continuation. When we get to that 5 chord, it will be typical for us to go back to tonic and then finish the idea with a variation that takes us all the way home to tonic. So this is the top staff. And that will be answered by a PAC. So we have you write the vertical intervals between the melody and the bass, which you've seen in many of the examples here, because it's helpful with proofreading. On the one hand, it lets you spot parallel fifths and octaves fairly easily. If you have 2 5s in a row, you better take a closer look and see if you've done something wrong. But also, it lets you check your intervals between the melody and the bass against your unabbreviated bass figures. Now, what does this mean? Here's a counterpoint. We're in G major. I want to proofread this. To proofread this, what I need to do is write out the unabbreviated bass figures beneath the staff and the annotations. So the 1 has no figures. We know that that's equivalent to a 5-3 chord. The 1-6 and the 2-6 chords, those are abbreviations for 6-3. 5-7 is an abbreviation for 7-5-3, and so forth. And the reason we do this is because if we analyze the outer voices, if we analyze these 2 melodies in terms of their intervals, the intervals we have should match up to the unabbreviated bass figures. So for instance, with the first chord, there's a 3, G up to B, and we notice that 3 is one of the unabbreviated bass figures. So that means we've used a chord tone. Same thing here, there's a 5th between the voices, and we see there is a 5, in fact, in the figure bass. Chugging along just fine here, we have another 3rd. And again, that 3rd is corroborated by the bass. Here we have B up to F sharp, which is a 5th. Now notice this. This sounded okay when we played it. But notice that in a 6-3 chord, there is no 5th above the bass. That F sharp is therefore not part of this chord. A 6th above B is G. So if we wanted to fix this easily, we need to take that F sharp and move it up to G. Now we have a note which is in the bass figures and part of the chord. And we could continue this and discover that the rest of our chords are all correct. So that's how writing the intervals between the staves helps you proofread your work. Now we're going to go into Sibelius, where we can work in real time on a first species example similar to what you have on upcoming homeworks. What you see on your screen is a first species harmonic counterpoint example set up in the manner that you'll be seeing for the next several homework assignments. Notice first of all that there is a bass in the bass staff, and that there are Roman numerals and bass figures to indicate what chords occur above them. Now there are also boxes above and below the grand staff here. The boxes above the staff are for you to write the notes that are in each chord in letter names, knowing that first species limits us to tones that are in the chord. The notes in the chord will be the ones that you can use in any given bar. So for instance, starting with the tonic chord, we're in G major, and the tonic has G, B, and D in it, and we can actually copy and paste that into any of the bars that contain a tonic triad in any inversion. Similarly, going over to the dominant here, notice it's a 7th chord, so there are 4 notes. We have D, F sharp, A, and C. and we can copy those and include them wherever we find a dominant 7th chord in any inversion. And then finally here we have the 2 chord, which in G major is an A minor triad. So there's our annotations that let us know what notes are available. For proofreading purposes, we also want to deal here on the bottom with the unabbreviated bass figures. That is to say, the figured basses that are all inclusive of the notes that will be available above any given bass note. Here with the first triad, there is no figured bass, which, as you know, implies that there is a 5-3 chord here. And in fact, we can enter 5-3 wherever we have triads that are not inverted. Now what about 5-4-2? What is the unabbreviated bass figure for 5-4-2? It's 6-4-2. That's a 3rd inversion 7th chord. The unabbreviated version of 6-5 is 6-5-3. And finally, the unabbreviated version of 7 is 7-5-3. This leaves only the 1-6 chords, which I'm sure you know have an unabbreviated signature of 6-3. So now we have our chord, tones, and our unabbreviated bass figures as a kind of a supporting system here. What I'm going to do, since we can't interact with one another in actually writing the counterpoint, I'm going to put a fairly rudimentary counterpoint in place, and then we can talk about how we would improve it. So we'll pause here for a second while I enter an adequate but not incredibly musical counterpoint. Okay, so here's our counterpoint, and I'll play this in both voices so you can hear it. There's a lot to commend about this counterpoint. Notice that it doesn't use too many perfect intervals. There's lots of good 3rds and 6ths here. It ends correctly on a 3rd above the bass. I've written 10, it should be 3. That's appropriate for an imperfect authentic cadence, as we can see here with this notation. But it's a little confined in its register. It noodles back and forth a lot between the G and the A. Notice that it just keeps going up and down between G and A, occasionally getting up to B. That's permissible, but it's really not ideal. So one thing I can do to start this out is move the opening note up to B. That'll give us a nice sweet 3rd on the opening sonority, and also allow us to have some nice contrary motion at the very beginning. So now, rather than having this at the opening, we have this, I think, rather more attractive. So that's good, but it hasn't really solved our register problem. It would be best if we could maybe push the line a little bit lower than that low G, and certainly higher than that high B. So one thing I think is useful to try here is to pull the 2nd note down so it's on an augmented 4th. That's going to do several things for us. It's going to increase the range of the melody down 1 step lower than it was before. It's going to give us a much more attractive dissonant downbeat. Notice now, instead of having at the opening, we're going to leap down into a tritone against the bass. And when that resolves, it's very musically powerful. It's also nice that the F sharp to G in the melody anticipates the F sharp to G that follows in the bass shortly thereafter. What can we do next? Well, I think we need to talk about the high point of the line. We hit our highest note 3 times here, and that's not ideal. It's better for an example, even of this length, to reach its highest note only 1 time. So in looking through this to see where we might be able to include a high note, I think that by maybe the bar with the 2 in it, we're at a place where we could maybe leap into a higher register. So what if we try a 5th there instead of an octave? And then, because we don't want to be leaping around too much, we can bring the 2nd to last bar maybe up to a 7th above the bass. That'll give us another nice crunchy dissonance. So let's hear how this sounds. Now we open up with a certain register, and then at the very ending we leap into a new register and descend into that final scale, degree 3. So here we are from the top. Well, now we're getting somewhere. Now we've got a really musical line. The only thing I have a problem with here is the second and third to last bar. That leap feels a little strange to me. This is just a matter of taste, but I really don't like that. I don't like that our leap is accompanied by a perfect fifth. It sounds kind of hollow to me. And it also sounds a little strange to go from that very stable perfect fifth to that spiky dissonant seventh. So how are we going to fix that? One thing we could try is taking the fourth to last bar up to a D. That means now we're not leaping into that high E anymore. And this changes it a bit. I think that's better. But I still don't love this. I don't know. That would be fine on your homework, but I'm being a perfectionist here. I think one way to improve that would be to actually have that spiky seventh above the bass in the dominant, that C natural. Maybe, since that's a tone that it shares with the previous chord, maybe we can do that and make that C our one repeated note. Notice what this does is it changes the high note of the example from E in the third to last bar to D in the fourth to last bar. Let's hear how it sounds. I like it. As you can see, it's possible to create a counterpoint that doesn't violate any rules, but which is really kind of unsatisfying in a musical way. So what I'm encouraging you to do is always to take a break once you've sketched your first solution, step back, and then ask yourself how you might tinker with it to make it more musical, more dynamic, better shaped, better crafted. And I think on the whole you'll find the experience to be a more satisfying one if what you produce really does have some music to it. So that's our introduction to harmonic species counterpoint. Next week we're going to move on to second and third species counterpoint. Until then, enjoy reviewing the video. As always, you can hit the Show More button underneath the video window to see bookmarks that can take you to whatever portions of the lecture you'd like to review.